Good morning, CUSEC! How are you guys doing today?
Coffee.
Party last night was good? Was good? Okay. All right. Awesome. So, how many of you guys have heard of Cordova? Just out of curiosity, just to see. Okay. Wow. Quite a lot of you. A lot more than I expected. That's great. So, for those of you who may not have heard of Cordova, essentially what Cordova allows you to do is use HTML5 and web technologies to build mobile apps. Now, historically, there's been this, I would say perception that web apps using the web technologies as for apps in your phone has tended to be very, very slow. Am I right? Has anyone experienced this sort of app that for some reason, if the phone goes offline, all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore? It's a little bit slower than sort of your native apps. Any of you guys heard of that or maybe experienced it? Just raise your hand. Let me see what. Okay, perfect. So probably a lot more of you have experienced the difference between native and web apps on your mobile device than maybe have even used Cordova to build your own apps. And that's all right. So I'm here actually to talk to you about how you can change that perception by using a bunch of tips that I have collected over the years to create more high-performant Cordova applications. So a little bit about me. I'm actually an alumni from McGill University, software engineering. And the first time that I actually spoke at CUSEC, I was still in school. And it was really awesome because Matthew, who's somewhere in this crowd, was the actual chair at the time. And he really allowed me the opportunity to come speak here. But I don't know if it's, I'm just like a filler guy or something, because every single time that I come speak at CUSEC, it's on Saturday morning at 10 a.m. So I'm not sure if this is on purpose or anything, but it's just sort of the second time that I'm here at this time. So it's not a problem. I like to code in Python, JavaScript, HTML5, Node.js, Cordova, Ruby on Rails. And my day job is evangelist at Microsoft. And what that lets me do is actually talk to a lot of developers, lots of startups, see how they're building code, how to help them with their technology needs, and really get them the latest news about what's happening with Microsoft tech. Now, at the same time, what that's let me see is how people build apps in different startups. So I've collected all of these little sort of patterns that have been taking place in different startups. And what I'm going to do today is really show you some of these tips that you need to do to actually implement Cordova apps that are very high performant. So Cordova, it's an open source framework. And it's used for developing mobile apps with HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript. And it supports a bunch of different platforms. So the main reason why anyone would want to use Cordova is really to be able to build to multiple platforms at the same time using the same code base. So the platforms that are supported are iOS, Android, Windows Phone 8, Windows 8, BlackBerry, Firefox OS. Now you may wonder, so if we're using all these web technologies, well, the camera API doesn't really exist on the web. Well, it didn't before, now it does. Well, how do we actually use that in our mobile app if we need to use the camera? So Cordova comes with a bunch of plugins that will abstract the way that you access these native features on each platform for HTML5 and JavaScript. So we'll abstract that for HTML5 and JavaScript. So even though you're using web technologies, things that you may not be used to, like a splash screen or maybe a vibration API, they are actually available for your web app using a standard JavaScript API for every single platform. So it's pretty great. Now you're probably wondering, okay, well, I may not have heard of Cordova, but I've heard of PhoneGap. Who's heard of PhoneGap? Okay, surprisingly a lot more of you. Well, actually not surprisingly. So originally, PhoneGap was the name of the open source version of what is now Cordova. But it was run by a startup called Nitobi in Vancouver. Yay, Canada, right? And essentially what happened was, they got acquired by Adobe. So Adobe has the right for the PhoneGap name, but the open source version is now called Cordova. There's a bit of a joke in the community. You write Apache Cordova, but you say PhoneGap so that people know what you're talking about. But I'm trying to just change that a bit. I'm actually going to only say Cordova for the rest of this talk. Now maybe you haven't seen some examples of Cordova apps, but two very popular ones are Health Tap and Untapped. Any of you guys heard of Untapped perhaps? You're all in college. You like beer, right? Okay. Well, essentially Untapped is a social network for beer aficionados. So you can go like check in at this different bar and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool. So let's get to the meat of the talk. Why so slow? So is it really that the Cordova technology itself is slow, or is it just the way that we're using it? So typically, the folks that are using HTML5 to build mobile apps are people who are coming from the desktop, building web apps on the desktop. So traditional web devs are perhaps maybe not the best equipped for mobile development because they come from this place where there's plenty of resources for your on your desktop. Like you have gigabytes of RAM. Now we're slowly getting to the point where on our mobile device we also have gigabytes. But at the beginning, there wasn't that much RAM in your phone. The other thing that might have happened is that you're coming to the mobile development, your approach is pretty much the same that you would, the same approach that you would use building web apps for the desktop. So think of using a lot of AJAX requests to keep the page load time low, but the interactivity high. So all of these web techniques, yes, they're amazing on the browser. We've got lots of libraries help you do that, jQuery, REST APIs, there's a whole bunch of different libraries out there. But fundamentally, when you're doing that on a device that may not always have a connection at all times, doesn't have a lot of processor power and not a lot of RAM, well then, it may not work as much. Sorry about that, my phone is ringing. So typically doing something like this, while perfectly acceptable on the desktop browser, it may not be great for your mobile device. So hopefully you guys have experience with HTML5. Well, you must have because some of you said that you've been developing HTML5 apps. But essentially what this looks like, it's a link. Now what's different here is that we're actually calling another PHP page to load our profile. So we're actually doing a web request whenever someone clicks on this link. Now if you take a look at that on the mobile device, and if half of your page, for every single action that the user has to do on your phone, he has to open up a new network connection on a device that may not always have a very solid network connection, that's going to be really slow. So building applications like traditionally in the web with multiple pages, multiple HTML files, will potentially be slower on your phone. Now, luckily there's a solution that even on desktop browsers has slowly been gaining a lot of usage, and that is building applications as single pages. How many of you guys have heard, perhaps even at this conference, the concept of single page applications? Okay, awesome, a lot of you. And the whole idea here is that we don't need to change pages or even refresh the browser to get new data. We're going to keep everything in the same page and we're going to dynamically load data. Now this is great, okay, especially on your mobile device because you don't need to make a whole new HTTP connection for every single link. But it also tends to lead to another problem, which is AJAX abuse. So constantly loading data from the web. Now, using AJAX for fetching data at all times, probably not very good when your network connection is not really great. Okay? So you don't really need to use AJAX to load a list of all the provinces or even the states. There's not that many. You can just embed that straight into your application, in your HTML. You don't need to load little data all the time, not create all these multiple different connections just to load pieces of your application. So you can hard code some data, right? That's a potential solution for not having to do a lot of AJAX requests. But at the same time, what's perhaps an even better solution is to actually just cache the data locally. Now the neat thing with the HTML5 API is that now there's solutions to do that. There's local storage, which is a whole key value store that's in your browser. There's lots of ways to actually cache data locally without having to constantly request it. And a great example, and this comes from a native app actually, is the Twitter app. If you ever notice, if you're not on Wi-Fi or you have a really bad LTE connection, when you open the Twitter app, it actually shows you the last tweets that it had, so maybe a day ago. And then they have this pull to refresh motion, right? So that's the whole idea. You cache this data, okay, so when the application loads, you actually see something. The worst thing that you can have for a user, okay, is an application that's blank. So it turns out your users who are using your application will think that if the interface is slow, it's pretty bad. Like they're used to data taking a long time to load because they'll see the data progress bar, because that's historically what we've been trained to because network connections were slower. What they're not used to is the interface taking forever to load. So that's another thing that you gotta keep in mind. Cache this data, show something right away, okay, and then you don't have to do all these AJAX requests all the time, but you'll get there you'll get the fresh data as users use your app. So another thing that's really common is this whole concept that JavaScript is equal to jQuery. So how many of you who've built web apps have pretty much only used jQuery? Okay, all right. So what I mean by that is people who say that, sometimes there's people who say that they're JavaScript developers, but what they really mean is that they know how to use jQuery really well, right? So that's essentially what happens even on mobile devices. Folks bring in jQuery when they might not need it. Okay, so if you don't know what jQuery is a cross-platform JavaScript library designed to simplify the client-side scripting of HTML. Now, this was great like 5 years ago when there was huge differences between each individual browser. Some browsers didn't follow the standards particularly well, others did, or maybe implemented things slightly differently. So jQuery had a big need. But if you're developing to a specific platform, let's say Windows Phone, for example, you know exactly how, you will know how exactly that platform implements different APIs. So do you really need jQuery? Probably not. Now, jQuery is not too bad. It doesn't take too much to load, but the real killer from the jQuery family of products is jQuery UI Mobile. Okay? So let me actually show you what jQuery Mobile does. So here's a very simple HTML element. It's a linked list. It's got a bunch of buttons that you can press, but essentially what it actually generates is all of this excessive elements inside each other. That's simply the way that it works, and it works that way for a good reason, to be able to support multiple different browsers across different platforms, but fundamentally on a mobile device, having so many elements just to create a simple list is just no good. We don't have that much processing power to handle this many elements in your HTML. So your loading time essentially affects the bottom line. If your app takes too long to load, okay, it won't be particularly liked. You'll get negative reviews, bad, one-star reviews on the app stores. So obviously, I can't just tell you that this is a problem. I want to give you a solution too. And one of the solutions out there is actually this new framework that was developed called Ionic. And essentially what it does, whoa, I heard someone say whoop. Okay, how many of you guys have heard of Ionic? Okay, quite a bit of you guys, awesome. And essentially what it does is it actually provides a bunch of different functionality, and the really neat part is that it's very focused on the performance. So what do they do? Well, they use zero jQuery. They do minimal DOM manipulation. So everything that they manipulate is actually in RAM, and it's very high performant. And they use hardware accelerated transitions as often as possible. And that's awesome, right? Because there are frameworks now that are being developed, especially over the last 6 months, that have gained a lot of popularity, like Ionic, for example, that remove this need to use some of the more traditional ways of building desktop apps on mobile devices. Now, if you're also just building a single-page application and your application is not particularly complex, well, do you really need to load all of this stuff? All of this jQuery styling to get that native styling, right? Because ideally, you want your app to look like a native app on that platform. Well, you don't need to use jQuery, and if you don't need to use Ionic either. If all you want is just the styling to look the same, well, there's a framework called Topcode. And what Topcode does, it's a CSS framework. It's very, very small. It's flat design, so it looks very similar to the flat design trend that exists on all devices right now. And it's beautiful, according to their developers. So you'll have to find out for yourself. And what they are very, very concerned about is performance. So even on their website, they actually show you how long it takes to render and visually see a button on a Nexus 4 device and on a bunch of other different devices out there. So they're very concerned with how not only it takes time to load the CSS framework, but how long it takes on different browsers on the platforms to actually visually render and for the user to see that CSS, that button. And it looks great across different platforms. It even works on the desktop, of course. So as I've been working a lot with different developers, I've sort of started to notice a bunch of gotchas. Now, page transitions, so transitions between pages, between dialogues in your app, they've sort of become now a standard feature, thanks to Apple. They were the first people to really put that everywhere in all their apps. Now, if you use jQuery Mobile, if you're very convinced that you want to, well then you have to be very careful with how you use page transitions. And in fact, one of the things that you might want to take a look at is this short videos about how to actually hardware accelerate page transitions. So that's a gotcha that you want to take into account and be very careful of. The other thing that you want to do is you want to sort of avoid box shadows and gradients. Now I know that it's a really cool feature in CSS3 to add box shadows, gradients, and all that stuff, but they're actually really not that performant on mobile devices. So some CSS3 properties can affect your performance. You just got to look for them and be careful. And here's another tip that I really like, and this is really useful for desktop development as well. Now, if you're using templates inside your HTML to reload data or all that stuff, what you want to do is you want to actually cache the compiled version of those templates. So if you're using underscore, if you're using the template library like mustache or handlebars, when you compile those templates, you want to make sure that they are cached, so that you don't recompile them every time you need to use the template. Or even better, if you're using a build tool like Grunt or Gulp, you can pre-compile these templates, include them in a JavaScript file, and load them straight up with your application. So here's a little sample code that you could use to just cache a template. It's very simple, okay? And alternatively, you can also pre-compile them with Grunt. Now I've talked about hardware acceleration. It's extremely important, especially on devices. You can use Translate 3D to take some of that processing power required off of the CPU and onto the graphics chips in your devices. Now of course, prevent the default event. If you're implementing the button click, don't let the event sort of keep propagating after the function has already been called. You got to prevent default, and this is also useful on desktops. So make sure that you prevent the default event if you've already handled it. Another thing that you could do is also cache your jQuery selectors. If you're using jQuery or any other selection library, typically you'll select the same element multiple times in your code. Well, what you can do is you can just literally cache that, assign it to a variable, and then keep reusing that selector. Now, of course, if you're building a single-page application, maybe you don't really need lots of jQuery selections, right? If you're doing this on a single-page application, probably what you can do is apply a ID selection, right? You know what's in your page, okay? And if you're using a good editor, it'll actually tell you, okay, if you use the same ID multiple times. Now, ID lookups are a lot more performant than CSS selection lookups, okay? They're actually a ton times more performant. So if you're building a single-page application, try to use IDs as much as you can, okay? Simply to make things a lot faster when you're selecting those elements. Now here's the sort of final, well, second to final gotcha and tip that I want you guys to remember. Now, a lot of web apps on the devices, they actually have a 300 millisecond delay between when you click on a button and when the event actually gets fired. This is because the different devices don't know if you're going to do a gesture in that 300 millisecond or if you're just actually trying to click on the app, click on a button. Now, there's a solution for this. It's called Fast Click. It's a GitHub library. You can inject it into your app and attach it to just the whole document right off the beginning, and essentially it'll eliminate that 300 millisecond delay. So it will fire that event the minute you press tap or you start a touch start or you do a touch end. And the reason why there's 3 different ways that a tap or click starts is because different browsers on different platforms have implemented using different events. Now one last thing, and I know that I'm running out of time quickly. Use CSS Sprite Sheets. If you haven't heard of CSS Sprite Sheets, they're a great way to put multiple images in the same file, and then when you're interested in putting in that image in your HTML, you're actually just loading a very specific portion of, well, you're loading the whole file at the beginning, but you're using only a specific portion of it at a time. This is a great way to also optimize your CSS Sprite performance. Now you're probably wondering, so why am I up here? Why does Microsoft care about all this stuff? Well, there's actually 2 reasons. One is that we're building a library called Win.js. It's a JavaScript toolkit that lets you build sort of high-performance controls for gestures and touch on multiple platforms. And the reason why we actually really care about that is because HTML5 and JavaScript are first-class citizens for building Windows apps and Windows phone apps. So all of that code is useless if you're not writing good code. So be careful how you write that code. your assumptions and your approach to development for mobile devices using web technologies shouldn't be the same as on the desktop. Now, the other reason why we also care about this is that we also have these tools called Cordova Tools for Visual Studio, and they let you do, so you build your Cordova apps, manage your plugins, debug, straight within Visual Studio. So it's great. Visual Studio is not just for C#, it's also for Python, HTML, Node.js, and Cordova apps. Now, one last thing that my employer definitely wants you to know about is developer movement. So if you haven't talked to us already, we're right outside, and we'd love to talk to you about developer movement, this easy way to get rewards for building apps. And there's different challenges, including a bunch of web challenges that I write that really are different challenges to change how you perhaps write your CSS browser prefix and stuff like that. So thank you very much. If you're interested in tweeting a tip at me, that's my Twitter handle. Thank you very much.